Okay, I'm James George, architect and painter, basically. I run this little practice that deals with sustainable design, and well, we think abstractly. We try to make a business out of thinking differently. So and in our spare time, we're trying to create a modern house architecture when we have the time for it. We try to look at ourselves like, as thinkers and urban planners and architects in one whole swoop. So we basically look at projects differently, and we try to create something different from every project. I studied at ABU Zaria. I funnily extended Lagos into the lagoon to finish school, and then I hit the streets of Lagos, and it's been the same since 2007.
Okay. So, can you tell us a little bit about what you know about the architect Nwoko?
I actually have studied quite a bit of Demas's work because when I left school, there was no real mentor in Nigeria to pick up architecture from. Um, I realized in Demas's work and the work that we're trying to do, there's a little similarity. It's the similarity of trying to rework traditional techniques and traditional ideologies into modern thinking. While we're a little bit more plastic than Demas is, we we did a long study of his breathing systems in some of his houses, his use of materials in the church, the contoured wall in the place in Benin. His work is, I wouldn't say inspiring, I'd say it's the ground zero for our practice, really, because before we started out, we did one or two trips to try to understand exactly what he was trying to do. So I think Demas is, for me, is a fundamental study, fundamental piece of Nigerian architecture that is taken for granted most of the times.
Can you situate his work within a global context?
Yeah, it will be called a little bit critical regionalism. It will be called something like that. But again, I would say it's a contemporary traditional Nigerian architecture, which is, again, as I said, what we're trying to do. So Demas is actually right in front there, and then we're just trying to do what he did in the 20th century for the 21st century with different materials and different ideologies. But the only problem I'd have with that is the fact that because of the lack of industry around where he built, it was difficult for him to make his materials available for other kinds of buildings. So while his work is critically regional as we would say our work is, we like to use materials that everybody else can use a little differently. So I mean, if that's the only difference between Demas's work and the critical regional style of thinking. Today, around the world, everybody's trying to make buildings breathe. It wasn't a thing in the 70s. It wasn't a thing in the 80s. And suddenly there's this guy, Demas, who knows that buildings should breathe, who knows that for a building to work properly in the tropics, you need less light and more air. That's genius for me. So his use of materials, everybody would say that. Well, I think the way he makes his buildings breathe. For instance, the exterior of the church is completely open, yet it's secure. So he has kind of redefined it. He goes back to the fundamental elements and makes a redefinition of them as he does the work. And I think that that's unprecedented in the work of architecture. Presently, we're doing a building in the north. It's a center for rural entrepreneurship, and we're creating this breathing. We created these breathing systems from the base of the building. So the build kind of cantilevers from its structure. We stole that directly from his house in Ibadan. Directly, it's the same detail with different materials. Less concrete. Instead of using mosquito nets, we're using perforated steel floors. So it's the same details. Also, there's what people don't realize about the church is that the tower actually is a chimney. It's also a chimney, so it takes out air. So it keeps that place cool. We're using that in several other buildings. We're building one right now. It's a 7-story building that has a stack tower over the lifts. And there's also his use of materials. I keep saying that while he uses stone and things like that that we don't use because we build architecture is urban, more or less, we use that same eclectic mix of things to try to create something different, something more responsive. So I think that that creates a pattern.
So, how will you situate Demas's work in the global context? That's in global context of architecture.
He's a precursor of contemporary Nigerian design. What would pain me as a person, as an architect, is the fact that Demas is not accepted as an architect in Nigeria. Demas is not studied in schools. So when I give lectures, because often, at least in the year, we give between 7 and 8 lectures around sometimes West Africa when we're lucky. I always say that there's this architect that you might not know about, Demas, that is globally a superstar that Nigeria deemed because we didn't quite understand what he was saying. In a time of stone and concrete and glass, he was building with materials that were warm, the materials that made living possible. I think that he's a late modernist, and he has opened the door for a proper Nigerian modernism if we study his work properly.
When I think about, when students of architecture or design study design history, it's students study from antiquity to contemporary times. And the emphasis is on studying like European or Greco-Roman civilization. Where do you see the importance of like African architects like Nwoko introduced into design curriculum, in Nigeria and globally, to let people understand global contributions and, listen to the other voices in architecture?
I just came from the Biennale in Venice. Now to get to the Biennale, we, as an office, we wrote a 140-page manifesto that dealt with the amalgamation and architecture through the time of 1914 to 2014. And in doing that, I realized that the education that I had is different from the education that most people have. Because I grew up in an an old city. I grew up in Zaria, and there's a divide right there in the center between Zaria City, the old architecture, and the newer architecture. So in our spare time in school, me and a few of the guys used to go and study these things and ask questions. So we realized that there were architects before we came. There was Mohammed something Babangoni. There was Abu Ishaq Asfahili, the guy who brought in the mud brick at that technology. So what we realized is, even in the study of history in schools, they teach house architecture, like in ABU in second year, for 30 minutes. Then they skip to other things. They teach Yoruba architecture for 20 minutes. They skip to other things. But the truth is that we can't practice European architecture, not because of the climate, but because of the culture. A walk down the street in Europe, the architecture makes sense. When you're in Rome and you see the Roman standing next to his building, it makes perfect sense. But you bring that building here, right outside FCMB's headquarters. I took this building so that I could look at those columns, and I could laugh at them every day. So basically, it's a waste of our time. Now, Demas, on the other hand, offers a whole lot of ideas an untapped potential and truths that can change the game of architecture. He's not afraid not to use a box. He's not afraid to try to think with a material that is not basically a building material. So these are things that if we study our traditional architecture, they are glaring. So I think that there must be a lot more people like Demas. We know of Demas, so I think by studying Demas, it will open up the doors to study more people like him. Maybe not as successful, that have thought about things differently, and then education here should be different. Architectural education should be totally different from here. One of the things that struck me most about the entrance into the chapel is its in its lack of definition. It's very defined, and that raw concrete, that brutal raw concrete, he's unashamed. It's just beautiful. And then the image of the front, that strong, open yet closed motif that brings in air and is secure and you can't quite fall out of it, and it borders the water body and the pew in front. It just, this is one of the elements of his architecture that makes it so extremely sustainable, because you don't need to have windows, you don't need to have, you have an entirely open space, yet it's closed in a way. So that's in itself is very exciting. I like the detail of the entrances. It's solemn, but it shows you that this is a master of his craft. The detail, the way the things and the forms he has used relate. The silent like poetry between that guy there and the barrel vaulted roof and the stairs that are almost floating but are not. The detail of that against the lack of detail of the wall. And this is one of the things I talked about with regards to sustainability. This space, like a zero space, like a space that nothing can happen, comes from the old English church. It used to be called a narthex or something like that. Yet here he has used it as a breathing device. So totally, air comes in totally all the time. You have no encumbrance. That door is a piece of work. We never get doors done like that anymore. The detail of the balustrades, the play of the forms against the columns, the way the columns stop, just it's between funny and tragic in certain ways. It's a different way of seeing the world, really, through his architecture. And the detail of the material on the ground, the stone. These are things that people don't typically use to build here. It would have been a concrete floor with marble finished and some that shines and things. So this is there and this works perfectly. This is a marvelous piece of engineering and sustainable architecture, really. Yeah, so we were here and it's talking about the contrast of the walls and how that contrasts to the ceiling and that floating cross and that shadow behind. I mean, that shadow is constant every time you go to the church. Now, I rarely ever have anything to say about this, the magnitude of the art behind this tower behind. When I went there the first time, it slapped me in the face, really. But it's a construction that I cannot quite understand. I like, and I don't think I can replicate. But it says something to me. I don't quite know what it is, but it does say something. And I like the cross at the top. It's pretty, for lack of a better word, funky. Yeah, so. architecture in this part of the world needs a new reading and a new learning and a new source to grow. The problem with architecture usually is the fact that there's nothing to feed it. It's like an animal, so you need to keep feeding it for it to grow. Now, in Nigeria, there's no back channel to feed the architecture to grow, and that's where Demas comes in, because he has created this wealth of knowledge on so many different subjects that are condensed into a few buildings that we can actually tap from to create a brand new architectural thinking and education. Almost like deconstructivism, but in a way, an African response to it. Because like a lot of the work in Europe can be attributed back here. So it's in that light that I'd like to say that in studying Demas more, in looking at his work a little bit closer, we'll be able to create a brand new, responsive and cheaper architecture for the 21st century Nigeria and indeed the African too. Finish.